Hi there, this is Teri from stampinmagic.com. Welcome back to my channel. For today's video, I'm going to show you how I create a version of this card. I'm also going to include a stamping technique. Now I've used this technique to create this tree slice image, and it's called the rock and roll technique. So let's get started. Before we create the card, I'm going to show you how to actually do the technique and include a few samples. I'm going to use the Rooted in Nature stamp set, which is a double set, and from that I'm going to use these two beautiful leaves for my samples. I'm starting with the larger of the two leaves, and I'm going to use crushed curry ink and old olive ink. You would normally use two shades of ink for this technique, one lighter and one darker. So I'm going to pick up my lightest colour ink, which is the crushed curry, and I'm going to cover my complete stamp. And then I'm going to take my stamp and rock it and roll it around on the old olive ink pad, and that will just pick up ink on the edges of the stamp. Now, one thing you must be aware of with this technique is that you can get ink on your blocks. For clear blocks it's not such a problem, but if you're using wood mount blocks you need to be careful that you don't get ink on your wooden blocks and spoil them. And you can see the beautiful image you get when you stamp this down. Now I'll just do that once more. So I've inked up with crushed curry, and I'm going to rock and roll my stamp around on that old olive ink pad. So the middle of the stamp doesn't touch the pad at all, it's just the edges. And again, you get a beautiful image. Obviously, every time you do this, you'll get a slightly different result. And here's a sample using these colours. So I've created the background using this large leaf and the two colours from my sample. I've just randomly stamped them all over. Right, so let's repeat that once more, and I'll change up the colours this time. I'm going to use Pool Party as my base, and then Pacific Point for the rock and roll. So ink up my stamp with the Pool Party first of all, and then I'll rock and roll it around on the Pacific Point ink pad. And you can see when I do this that it's only really the stamp that moves. I try and keep the ink pad still. And again, you get a beautiful result when you stamp this down. And here's another sample using those colours. Again, I've used it just to stamp my background. Of course, you can use more than two colours of ink if you want to. I'm going to use 3 for my next sample. This time I'm going to keep the ink pads flat on the table. I find I've got more control over the stamp if my ink pads are flat. You can control how much ink you pick up by adjusting the angle that you hold the stamp at in relation to the ink pad. So the flatter the stamp, the more ink you will pick up. The more angle you have between the stamp and the ink pad, the less ink you will pick up. The 3 colours of ink I'm using here are Powder Pink, Highland Heather and Blackberry Bliss. And here's another sample using those colours for the background. I have one last example for you, and this one uses 3 colours as well. I've got crushed curry, old olive and then cherry cobbler. And this time I'm going to use the smaller leaf. So I'm starting with crushed curry, and then I'm going to rock and roll on the old olive, And if you don't get enough ink the first time you go round, you can always add more by going in again. And then finally, cherry cobbler. And this is the result I get. And here is the sample card using this colour combination. I've actually used two different combinations this time. For the larger leaf, I used crushed curry as my base, then pumpkin pie, and then finally Cajun craze around the edge. And here are the 4 samples all together. Okay, so now we can create the card. I'm not going to make it exactly the same. I'm going to change a few things, but I'm going to start off with the technique. So I have my tree slice stamp, and I'm going to ink it up first of all with Sahara sand, and then I'm going to do my rock and roll with early espresso. So you can see I'm holding the stamp at quite an angle. I don't want the colour to go too far into the middle, I just want it on the edge, and then I can stamp it down. There is a coordinating die set that goes with the Rooted in Nature stamp set, but there isn't actually a die that matches this image, so it needs to be cut out by hand. And I'm just cutting it out with a very narrow border of white all the way round. I'm going to create the sentiment panel next, and I'm going to use Thinking of You and this foliage image. I'm going to start with crumb cake ink and the foliage image, and I'm going to stamp it off each time I use it. I just want a light tone of ink underneath the words that I'm going to stamp. Then I'm going to switch to early espresso ink and stamp my sentiment. And I'm going to cut this out using one of the ovals from the Stitched Shapes framelets, the second largest. And this is my finished sentiment panel. Now I've already stamped and cut out a selection of leaves and foliage that I want to use on my card. These are the images I used. I stamped them all in 3 colours using Pear Pizzazz, Granny Apple Green and Shaded Spruce. They were all cut out using the coordinating dies from the Nature's Roots framelets. I used the outline shapes only. I also cut out one of each from gold foil, and these I ran through the Big Shot using the subtle embossing folder. These are the other supplies that you need to complete this card. First of all, I have a Shaded Spruce card base. Now this is half an A4 sheet scored to create a portrait card. Of course you can use 8.5 by 11 cardstock and cut that in half. Then I have an early espresso layer and a crumb cake layer, and this I've run through the Big Shot with the layered leaves embossing folder. For the inside of the card, I have a white mat and a strip of early espresso and another strip of white card. I'm going to stamp the little white strip using the foliage stamp and crumb cake ink, initially stamping off each time and then going in with full strength just in some areas. This can then be glued onto the early espresso strip, cut down to size and then added to the bottom of the white panel. It can then be glued inside the card base. You can then add your crumb cake layer onto your early espresso layer and then position these onto the front of your card base. Next, I'm going to add my sentiment panel to my tree slice using dimensionals. Then I'm going to add more dimensionals all over the back of this. I'm keeping away from the very edges, so this will help when I come to tuck my leaves and other foliage all around the panel. I'm going to double up on the ones on the right hand side because this sits higher than the left hand side. Then you can remove all of the dimensionals backs and add the panel to the card. Finally, you can position all the leaves. I'm just going to tuck them into place without gluing initially. I'm not going to use them all. I think I used far too many on my first card. So I'm just selecting which ones I want to go where and placing them. And I finally decided to use just 3 clusters. And then I can go ahead and glue everything in place. The sequins I'm using are from the Metallics sequin assortment, and I'm using my Take Your Pick multi-purpose tool to help me place them, and then I'm using a small dot of Tombow multi-purpose adhesive to stick them in place. And that's it, my card's complete. Here are the 2 cards together. I think I prefer my newest one. It's a bit less cluttered than the original. But which one do you prefer? Leave me a comment and let me know. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this project. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notifications bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. Bye for now.